Is this live? Is this live? Second delay. Okay, let's see if we can see that. That's weird. Okay. There's going to be a noise feedback. If you're watching this live, will you let me know that you're here so that I know that this is working? Okay, well, somebody's here. I'm not sure if it's one of my students or a random bot. If you have any questions, will you just type them in the chat? I've got about a 30-second delay between what I'm seeing. It is a real student. It is a real student. I'm excited. Good to know about the school accounts. So if you have any questions or something specifically you want me to review, just let me know what it is, because as far as I can tell, you're the only one here so far. By the way, in case you didn't notice, and I haven't worn this to school yet, I do have a Franz Ferdinand sweatshirt on. I'm going to cut all of this part out when I actually publish this, I hope, by the way. But if you have any particular questions, let me know. And if you don't, I'm not sure where to start. You want me to start at the beginning? By the way, I like this review book series. I think I've told you guys this before, but oh, hi, Chase. It's just nice because it's, when you sit down to review, it's got everything like nicely condensed. So you're not like flipping through the book looking at bold terms. All right. So there's a request to start at the beginning and go forward with the Italian Renaissance and the Reformation. We're really going to start at the beginning. I just want to say that there's three big things that I had you guys learn about in the Middle Ages, the medieval period, the 100 Years' War between France and Britain, the Black Death, and the millions of death that happened as a result of that. And then also the Great Schism, because all three of those things, I think, really challenged people's faith in, I don't know, the status quo, the church, life as they knew it. So if we're starting with the Renaissance, I taught you guys an acronym, and the acronym was HIS, which stands for Humanism, Individualism, Secularism. And the humanism is kind of the idea that it's like a belief in the value of human achievement, and then it's also involves classicism. So looking back at the classical Greek and Roman languages, values, and texts. It could be art. There weren't really paintings left over from Greek and Roman times. I suppose there were a few mosaics, but there were statues, there was architecture, and there were works that were being just reread, I guess. So things like Cicero. And the humanities really focused on education and making sure that those ideas were well known. And the very idea that you would like seek to improve yourself like that is a sign of individualism, that the individual has merit, that the individual has value, that eventually the individual has rights. That's going to come a little bit later, but also just really valuing the expertise and genius of individuals, that they had something to contribute, and that they would and could and should improve the world that people were living in. So this starts real early with Pico, Oration on the Dignity of Man. That was 1486. And he just talks about the sort of dignity of humans and the belief in their potential. One of the earliest works that we looked at was The Prince by Machiavelli, which was 1513. And we compared Machiavelli to Erasmus. So The Prince by Machiavelli said it's better to be feared than loved. And Erasmus said basically that, and his work was Education of a Christian Prince, talked about how important it was for a prince to be educated and know a lot about their people, whereas Machiavelli was more interested in a prince's power. And this kind of was an instructional. The Prince was sort of an instructional manual for the Medicis from Machiavelli about like how to attain and hold power. Then we talked about the Ninja Turtle artists. So we talked about, in order, the oldest would be Da Vinci, the Mona Lisa, the what else did we do by Da Vinci? I think we did Virgin on the Rocks. And we looked at the different techniques that he did. So chiaroscuro was that contrast between light and dark, which you can actually see. They were like painting things like shadows under people's necks, really paying attention to light and focusing on realism. Realism was a really big thing because they didn't remember there's no cameras then or anything, so painting was all you've got. Then we looked at Michelangelo. Actually, I should go back because the oldest Ninja Turtle would be Donatello. He's a good century before these guys. Probably a little bit of overlap with Da Vinci when he was really young because Da Vinci was so much older. But we looked at his bronze statue of the David, and the bronze statue was the first bronze to be cast since classical times. So it's a fairly complicated process that he kind of figured out how to do again. Then we went to Da Vinci, and then we went to Michelangelo. For Michelangelo, we talked about the marble David, which is so different from Donatello's David. Donatello's David was very kind of feminine and young. And David, by the way, was the patron saint of Florence. So when Michelangelo was asked to create this sculpture, it was really to be a symbol of Florence. So Michelangelo depicts David as this just, man at the prime of his health and strength, and is really meant to be this perfect figure of the human form. And they had no shame in nudity. Well, the artist didn't. Some of the papal figures did, the cardinals and things, but they saw the human body as a reflection of God's divine perfection, that if humans were created in God's image, the human body was also perfect and therefore should not be ashamed of it. So a lot of these statues and paintings are of nudes, and that's also because they're imitating the classical art, much of which was nude. And then we looked at Raphael and the School of Athens. Also for Michelangelo, just to go back, the Sistine Chapel, the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. They all did other works as well, but I'm hitting kind of the high points. And then Raphael was the School of Athens, was the big one that we looked at. And that one is, totally secular themes. So that was the third theme of the Renaissance, is secularism, that they're not just looking at religious stories. They're looking at a lot of ancient Greek and Roman mythology, which, would have been a secular topic for them. And then there's a question here about domes and the idea of the Renaissance man, or l'uomo universale. I'm butchering the Italian there. I have no idea how to actually pronounce it. But Brunelleschi was the man who did the Renaissance dome in Florence. And he went back, and you really see the classical impact here. He went back and looked at the Pantheon in Rome. It was like, okay, this is how they did it. He looked at sort of the rib structures, and that was sort of the secret too, because domes are complicated structures. The weight of them often forces them to kind of collapse in. So Brunelleschi did a couple of things. He had these like ribbed supports around, and then he sort of had a dome within a dome, and then these interlocking bricks that were like helping to support the weight of the dome. And then Michelangelo did the dome at St. Peter's. The Pope said he wanted the biggest dome in the Christian world. So Michelangelo went and measured the Parthenon, but Parthenon. I might have said Pantheon earlier. I screw up those words sometimes, so sorry if I slipped. Um, I know I'm confusing even myself. Anyway, he looks at the building in Rome and measured the dome. I'm also really tired, so sorry if this is a little jarbled. He measured the dome, and basically the dome in St. Peter's is just a smidge smaller. In St. Peter's, the dome was designed by Michelangelo, so that could be another work that you could attribute to him. And then we also had the columns coming out around the side, the kind of mathematical perfection of that. And then Renaissance man is this idea of the multi-talented man. And I think Da Vinci is a good example of this, that he was not just an artist, but he was also an engineer. He was a scientist. Like, to be a Renaissance man is to be kind of interested in everything and talented at a lot of things. So he was a genius in a lot of different ways, is kind of what that means. So Da Vinci is, I think, the easiest example of that. Okay, so those were the big things of the Renaissance. There were a couple of other people that we mentioned in there. Castiglione, on the, sorry, that's the courtier. He talked about courtly behavior. So you see a lot of Renaissance values like really permeating into kind of that everyday life stuff. The other big idea there is patronage, that, you know, the Medicis are really valuing the idea of beautifying their city, their homes, their tombs. So they're spending money on art and on beautification and on poetry. And then also they're wealthy enough to do that. Like, one question that you might think about with the Renaissance is why Italy? And there's a couple of reasons. One, you've got trade coming in from all over because it's in the center of Mediterranean trade, which is also why, like, Venice is, you know, where some of the earliest plague comes into Europe. And then also Florence is relatively wealthy, and they have most of Italy, or all of Italy, were these city-states. So like Florence and Milan, and had some independence to kind of pursue things on without having to like constantly defend borders of a larger country. Now the city-states were frequently at war, but it somehow seems less taxing than like the 100 Years' War, which involved a much broader area. Okay, and then what else do we want to say about the Renaissance? I think the other thing that you would want to talk about would be the spread of the Renaissance to the north. In the late 15th century and then into the 16th century, it spreads to France, Germany, England, Spain. The Treaty of Lodi, I don't think we talked about that in class, but it brought Milan, Naples, Florence, Venice, and the Papal States into kind of a mutual defense alliance. So they're like sort of coming together as one. And that's going to really be sort of a period of peace and equilibrium, but eventually that will be broken up. And then that's going to help the Renaissance spread northwards because of people from other parts of Europe sending in troops, often to defend the Pope. And if you think back to the medieval period, you know, they had the Avignon papacy. So the idea that like the French could, you know, take over the papacy was an ongoing concern. You also had, you know, people who were coming to Italy to study and then returning home. You had people leaving Italy, like sort of wandering troops of musicians and things like that. And then you get much more use of the vernacular. Vernacular is a specific term that's in the IB key terms that you need to know. And it basically just means using the local language instead of Latin. The printing press is going to be a huge thing. Around 1445 to 1450, Johannes Gutenberg starts using movable type in the German city of Mainz, and that's going to make all of this kind of writing more accessible to people. And the printing culture just explodes in Europe. Erasmus is one of the big humanists in the North. In the North, you see more Christian humanism, so they're doing a lot more of um, translating the Bible from the original, like Greek or and then trying to make the translations more accurate, and then also eventually Martin Luther will translate the Bible into the vernacular, into German. In England, France, and Spain, you had kind of stronger monarchies. So those new monarchs that we talked about, who were really, building stronger armies so that they could fight more wars, so that they could consolidate their power. But then that also meant they had to have more tax collectors so that they could pay for the armies. So you get stronger monarchies, and then the Renaissance is really going to be centered more in kind of the royal courts there. So I think those are the big things for the Renaissance. Sin is the big thing to remember, and then if you can remember a work of art from each of the Ninja Turtles plus Erasmus and Machiavelli, I think you're in decent shape. Did I say sin? The acronym for the Renaissance is HIS. The acronym for the Reformation, which is next, is SIN. And just before I move on, I just saw a request for education and gender roles. What would we say about I think that you really get education is much more widespread because of that focus on the humanities. People are trying to learn Latin and Greek so that they can read those classical works. And so a lot of people who aren't necessarily geniuses, like, say, Lorenzo de' Medici, are really well versed in those languages and texts, even if they're not producing art in the way that the masters were. They're still very much a part of that conversation. And then in terms of gender roles, I can't remember anything that they specifically lay out that you needed to know about gender roles in the Renaissance. I'll think on that, and I'll come back to this in a second here. But let's get into the Reformation, because there is a lot to say about gender roles in the Reformation. I do think you had slightly, well, let me come back to the gender roles. Okay, so for the Reformation, the date that I had you guys learn was 15, not 16, 17, October 31st. So basically Halloween is when Martin Luther nails the 95 Theses to the door of the church in Wittenberg. But before we get to that huge turning point, which just explodes everything, there are a couple of earlier reformers that I think are worth knowing of. Jan Hus in the Bohemian states and John Wycliffe in England. They were usually questioning things like the infallibility of the Pope. And then generally earlier reformers were persecuted. So and I can write their names in the chat. No, I can't. My computer's not letting me at the moment. There we go. Jan Hus and John. Wycliffe. I think that's how you spell Wycliffe. Okay, so for the Reformation, the acronym was SIN. So Martin Luther had in his 95 Theses, his biggest complaint was indulgences. Now, the Pope had been selling indulgences in order to fund the construction of St. Peter's. So the Pope was not just the head of the Catholic Church, he was also the head of the Papal States, which was like a kingdom, right? Like he's both a political and a religious leader. And that meant he had to keep an army as well as, beautify and glorify the church. So he's using his kind of religious influence in order also to strengthen his political power. So a lot of the Renaissance popes were were more political rulers than religious leaders, were more interested in the political than the religious. And so Martin Luther criticized the indulgences that they were selling in order to fund St. Peter's was the big thing, but also just other expenditures from the Pope. There was a man named Johann Tetzel who was sent by the Pope to basically collect money throughout the Holy Roman Empire. And Martin Luther just thought this was an abomination. He visits Rome in order to sort of further his study. He was very serious. He'd originally trained to be a lawyer, but becomes this very serious theologian after he has a religious experience. And in Rome, he's just shocked by the corruption. You know, the prostitutes in the street, the selling of indulgences, they're charging people to like visit reliquaries, which were like the bodies of saints, literal actual bodies like bones in fancy cases and things like that. And then like limiting their time praying there. So he really sees that it's much more about money and much less about religion, which he found offensive. So the church was really discouraging any kind of reform because they were protecting the power of the priesthood, saying the Mass in Latin, which meant that a lot of priests didn't understand what they were saying, and the vast majority of the congregants didn't understand Latin. And they insisted that the Bible only be published in Latin. So Martin Luther then comes up with three big themes for his new religion. And I taught them to you in Latin just because I find them easier to remember that way. And then I also taught them to you in English. So in Latin, it's sola fide, sola gratia, and sola scriptura. So you can have religious knowledge only through faith, you can have salvations through God's grace, or salvation by faith alone is Martin Luther's big, if you're only going to remember one thing, remember that. Because the Catholic Church said that you could get salvation by doing good works, that if you said, X number of Hail Marys, or if you climbed the steps and for each step you said an Our Father, which was a prayer, you could get to heaven. Or also you could pay to free your father who had been dead for 10 years. You could spring his soul from purgatory and make sure that he got into heaven. You could even pay ahead for sins not yet committed. So Luther's just horrified by all of this, and sola scriptura, sola fide, and sola gratia are like his big attempts to reform what he saw as massive corruption in the church. He also believed in a priesthood of all believers, that people, that everyone should have, that everyone had God's grace, and therefore all had the ability to like truly know God, especially through reading of Scripture. So Lutheran churches still put a lot of focus on reading Scripture, reading and understanding the Bible on an individual level. Salvation by faith alone contradicted the church's idea that you could do good works, that it was a combination of faith and works of piety and charity that would get you into heaven. Sola Scriptura contradicted the whole hierarchy of the Catholic Church, because the Pope was like the head of the church, and then under him were the cardinals, and under him were the bishops, and they're all hymns because there were no women allowed. And also that, there's a lot of tradition in the church, a lot of interpretation of like papal bulls were proclamations put out by the Pope that were meant to be interpreted as the Word of God. And then, the church really controlled who could read and interpret Scripture. So the salvation or priesthood of all believers really contradicted that. So Luther nails the 95 Theses. Printing press spreads it all over, right? Without the printing press, that really, I think, had changed so much. And also the church had the Catholic Church had gotten more corrupt. He had a lot of followers, but he's then called to the Diet of Worms, and he's officially excommunicated in 1520, in part because Frederick of Saxony was protecting him. And there were these electors, I think there were 7 electors of the Holy Roman Empire, and Frederick was one of them. Yeah, one of 7. And so he was a pretty powerful in and of his own right. We don't really know, did he protect Luther because he resented the political power of Rome and he wanted to break away in Saxony to break away from the Holy Roman Empire? Or did he protect him for religious reasons and he really believed in Luther's reforms? We don't have a lot from Frederick of Saxony, but I think that those are good kind of questions to ask in analysis, like to suppose that there are different reasons that he might have protected Luther. So he's eventually excommunicated in 1520, and then by 1529, like they formed a new religion, and were known as Protestants. And the root there, protest, is because they're protesting the Catholic Church. Luther starts writing a lot. He puts out a lot of pamphlets that are spread all across the German states because in the whole Holy Roman Empire, because of the printing press. He wrote things like so there were these peasant uprisings in the 1520s, because if we say that everyone can be a priest and that everyone has equal knowledge of the Bible, then does that mean that peasants have to follow the words of their princes? And Luther actually says yes. So even though he's seems to be this sort of man of the people who's presenting all of these pretty serious reforms to where knowledge comes from, in the end, he writes this. They changed the title to something like "To the Thieving, Murderous Hordes of German Peasants," which basically says you should have loyalty to your prince first and your beliefs second, which is, I think, sort of an interesting thing that you might not expect from Luther. Some of the bloodiest battles that happen because of this are in France, the French religious wars. Protestantism was declared illegal in 1534, and the French Protestants, who were largely Calvinists, were sort of originally tolerated, but then you have the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre, and I'd have to look up the date of that. I know that the Edict of Nantes was 1598, but I don't recall the date of St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre. It'd be a bit before that. The Edict of Nantes in 1598 basically allowed for toleration of Protestants. And before I go on to what happened in other countries, I should talk about the different Protestant faiths, which were, let's see, you would want to remember Calvin, the City of God in Geneva. He creates a theocracy, very strict rules about no dancing, no gambling, basically anything. They're just very strict in very what's the word? The idea of the paterfamilias, that the dad is the head of the family. So it's very kind of hierarchical. And then they had these people in the chosen in Geneva were considered predestined to be saved. So if you were excommunicated from the city, that is also probably damning your soul to hell if you were a strict Calvinist. And then you have Zwingli, who was in Zurich and kind of fighting back against the Holy Roman Empire. What other reformers did we talk about? If I'm forgetting any that you have questions about, you can put their names in the chat and I'll go back and hit them. Let me look at my list here and see if I have anything that pops out at me. Oh, other term that you should know from this period is the Peace of Augsburg, which in the German states will end some of that fighting, and it's Augsburg, 1555. I like that date because it's easy to remember because it's all fives, which basically said, Quio regio ius religio. I'm sure I'm butchering the Latin, but it means whoever rules his religion, so to each prince his own religion, which basically said that whatever region of the Holy Roman Empire you were in, you had to follow the faith of your prince. Oh yeah, the Anabaptists, duh. So the Anabaptists believed in adult baptism, and they also believed in separation of church and state, and that made them pretty dangerous and kind of like um, hated by all of the other Protestant reformers. Whereas the other thing we talked about with the Protestant Reformation was the idea of separation in church of church and state. So Martin Luther is like Prince first. Um, Geneva was a whole theocracy, and then we should talk about the English Reformation because in that they basically have a um, the prince becomes the head of the or the king becomes the head of the new religion. Um, so the English Reformation is unique because it's not so much about religious turmoil. Henry had actually been declared a defender of the faith because he wrote actually, he probably didn't write it. Thomas More was his advisor and also a friend of Erasmus. He was a philosopher and theologian. Um, he wrote in defense of the seven sacraments because Martin Luther had reduced the number of sacraments in the Catholic Church, which were like religious um, steps that one had to take in their life. You might not necessarily take all of them because you might not become a priest, for instance, which is one of the seven sacraments. But Martin Luther had reduced it from 7 to 3. So Henry, probably actually written by Thomas More, writes this defense of them. He's named a defender of the faith. So he was not supposed to be king. He had an older brother named, I think it was Arthur, who was supposed to be king, who had married Catherine of Aragon. Her parents were Ferdinand and Isabella, who were the two really powerful monarchs who had unified Castile and Aragon, and then were like really pulling Spain together. Because the idea of a country like was not really a huge thing around 1490. It was a fairly new idea. They were more sort of small, city states or maybe principalities, but like these big sort of nation states that we think of will come later. So Ferdinand and Isabella are really beginning that process in Spain with the Reconquista to sort of forcing the conversion of people back to Catholicism and forcing people who didn't convert to leave. And so their daughter, Catherine of Aragon, is who married Henry's older brother. He dies shortly thereafter. Whether or not the marriage was actually consummated is a matter of much debate. And yes, they do have a lot of discussion about whether or not they actually did the deed. But she had no children, and with the older brother, and therefore there was like no 100% proof of whether or not the marriage had been consummated. So Henry marries Catherine when his brother dies, and he becomes king because that would continue the alliance with Spain. That's what princesses were for, really, was securing alliances. There were already some kind of English language Bibles that were circulating around the country, and as Henry's really starting to consolidate his power, he uses Protestantism as an opportunity to kind of break from Rome. And there's this issue of he needed a son. So Catherine of Aragon was older. She had a daughter, Mary, who and then had no more children. And Henry divorces her or asks the church for divorce. They say no. And so he creates a new church with himself as the head. So the Church of England, I called in class probably Catholic Light, but very similar to a lot of traditions with Catholicism. Divorce was allowed. Henry was the head of the church instead of the Pope, or really the monarch, I guess, but Henry in this case. And so in 1534, he officially breaks with the church. He also uses that as an opportunity to basically pillage all of the monasteries and Catholic land in England to support a series of wars. And so under Henry VIII, England is going to get a lot more powerful, and the wealth of those pillaged monasteries, which he had dissolved, is part of how he funds that. So now there's going to be like all sorts of religious chaos because so Henry marries, it goes divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. The 6 wives of Henry VIII. You don't need to memorize all of them, but Catherine of Aragon, I would remember. Anne Boleyn, his second wife, was a Protestant. So he has a daughter with her, and that's Elizabeth. His next wife, actually, all the other wives are going to have to be Protestants because now he's created a new church, and so he couldn't really marry a Catholic again. And so his third wife, Jane Seymour, has a son, Edward the Sixth, but she dies shortly after childbirth. And so Edward the Sixth, when Henry dies, will become king. But he dies fairly young, 14-ish, and really had sort of a regency ruled by the brother of Henry's last wife. And so Edward dies. First, he put out the Common Book of Prayer, which basically sort of was like, there's a lot of talk about like sort of de-Catholicizing the Anglican Church or the Church of England. And then after him, it goes to the daughter with Catherine of Aragon, who is a Catholic, whose mother has been locked in a tower all of this time. She marries Philip II of Spain, who was the king of Spain after Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, retired. She dies with no children. And then Elizabeth, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, the Protestant, who had been beheaded, becomes queen. She rules for like 60 years, and it's the golden age of Elizabeth. She never marries, she never has children, and so then you have this political crisis. But in the meantime, when this whole succession issue is happening from Henry to Elizabeth, you've gone a Catholic who converted to Protestantism so he could get a divorce, to his Protestant son, who's like passing these religious laws in order to kind of make himself seem more powerful because he's so young and he has to seem powerful, to Mary, who's Catholic and married to the King of Spain, who probably has eyes on some sort of joint rulership because Spain was more powerful than England. And then back to Elizabeth, who's Protestant and is like pretty young when she comes to the throne, too, 20, 21, and so has to do quite a lot to get the bishops to support her. And so there's early on, Mary, there was a lot of persecution of Catholics. And under Elizabeth early on, there is some persecution. Mary persecuted Protestants. That's where she gets the nickname Bloody Mary. Elizabeth, there was some persecution of Catholics under Elizabeth, but really she is a politique. I'm going to put the word in the chat because it's spelled the French way, which basically means she favors stability, political stability over religion. Okay. What did we say? I talked about Calvin. I talked about, by the way, those chosen in Geneva under Calvin were called the elect. They were elected. They were like sort of predestined to go to heaven. Anabaptists captured, I forgot to say, the city of Münster, M-U with an umlaut, N-S-T-E-R, seized a lot of property of people who weren't Anabaptists and burned all the books except for the Bible. And then the Protestants and Catholics saw them as kind of a threat to the social order because they believed in separation of church and state. And so the rebellion was put down by a Lutheran prince. And the Anabaptists were pretty violently repressed and driven underground, which is why a lot of them will eventually flee to the colonies in the New World. The Roman Church, meanwhile, the Catholic Church, has its own Reformation. The big things you would remember there would be Ignatius Loyola, the Jesuit. The Jesuits were originally called the Society of Jesus. They came to be known as Jesuits. Their two goals were education and spreading and converting other people to Catholicism. They saw themselves as sort of soldiers in a war against Satan. A lot of them became missionaries, so they're some of the first to visit. There was usually a priest with most, like conquistadors, for instance. The Council of Trent is the big thing that you would need to know about the Counter-Reformation or the Catholic Reformation. I think it's probably better to call it the Catholic Reformation, but that's a long story. Um, and that would be 1545. It started in 1545, but it took like 10 years or something. But they got rid of a lot of the abuses, the selling of indulgences, but they the Protestants had kind of hoped for reconciliation, but the Council of Trent basically says that, we're not going to compromise. We still say there's 7 sacraments. We still um, have the Mass is going to be in a certain way. It's going to be in Latin. Um, and they will put into place an inquisition where they're trying to basically suss out heretics, and a lot of them are executed. Some of them tortured and executed. And then the other big thing that they did was the Index of Banned Books, which basically said anything that wasn't with a church teaching was placed on the Index of Banned Books. All right, that's the Reformation. Do you feel good on exploration? Do you want me to talk about exploration? Because the next question I saw was on the 7 Years' War, which is quite a ways forward. Because we would also have the exploration, scientific revolution, and I just want to point out really a big important idea here on these early units. You have the Renaissance, the Reformation, exploration, and the scientific revolution. And they're all happening like really tightly in a really big century of change. So if we look at the Renaissance, for instance, we're talking like mid 1400s and on. There's not like a clear turning point date for the Renaissance the way that there is with other things, but it's certainly still going on in 1517 when Martin Luther nails the 95 Theses to the door of the church. So those, the Renaissance kind of starts, and then the Reformation, this might be backwards. The Reformation is going to have some overlap with that. And then 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, which begins the age of Spanish and Portuguese exploration. Well, the Portuguese had begun before that with Prince Henry the Navigator and the navigation school. Because of the defeat of Constantinople by the Turks in 1453, that's going to cut off trade with the Silk Road to the east, and so the Portuguese start looking down the coast of Africa. So anyway, that's all at the same time, right? And then you have 1543 is Copernicus's on the revolution of heavenly spheres. So within 100 years, you've got all 4 of those things happening in some fashion. So I think that's just a really 1450 to like 1600 is just a time of a lot of change. Okay. I'm going to answer Isaac's question about the 7 Years' War real quick, and then I will come back to the English Civil War, English monarchs, Glorious Revolution, absolute monarchs. Oh yeah, absolute monarchs is a big topic there too. Okay, the 7 Years' War is actually, it might be good. The 7 Years' War, we didn't get to spend a ton of time on it in class, and it's definitely a big topic. And I will look up the episode, but I know that one of the crash course episodes talks quite a bit about the 7 Years' War, and it would be the one right before the French Revolution. I think it's called like 17th century warfare, maybe. But the 7 Years' War actually starts with, in the U.S., it would be called the French and Indian War. The 7 Years' War got sort of multiple pieces. On the one hand, it was this fight between, it goes all the way back to the War of Austrian Succession when Maria Theresa became the Holy Roman Empress. She was a woman, and so there was, her father had written this law called the Pragmatic Sanctions, basically allowing her to become the Empress. And Frederick the Great would use that opportunity to take Saxony from the Holy Roman, to take, I think it was Silesia actually, to take Silesia from, shoot, I'm sorry, I'm blanking on this. I'm going to have to look it up. If one of you want to look that up real quick, War of Austrian Succession, who did Frederick the Great, or what territory did Frederick try to take for Prussia? Basically, Prussia and Austria are going to be sort of butting heads a little bit over who should become the monarch there, with all of Europe sort of taking sides. But the bigger question in the 7 Years' War is the question of colonies and like who's going to control what in the colonies. So, big picture, the British are going to establish their dominance in the 7 Years' War and really push the French into just like Quebec. Um, Whereas previously, the French had, for instance, owned all of the Louisiana Purchase. They don't lose that totally until much later. Napoleon is the one who sells it to the U.S. under Thomas Jefferson around 1805, 1802. I'd have to look up the year of the Louisiana Purchase. But the 7 Years' War is like the 1750s and 60s. And basically, by that, what they're talking about, the territory they're talking about in the colonies at that point is like dominance over the area around the 13 colonies and sort of like what would have been the frontier along the edge of those colonies. And you get various like Native American tribes joining sides with the French to fight against the British in the hopes that they would get better treatment from them. And then basically they all get kind of squashed. And I guess the frontier would have been anything around the Appalachian Mountains and then just kind of west of that. So France and Britain, I would say, are the most significant countries in the 7 Years' War. And then the conflict over colonies is what starts that, with Britain being pretty dominant. All right, let's talk about absolute monarchs. Do you feel good on the scientific revolution and exploration? Let's see here. Let me look at my notes. All right, I want to start with the idea of feudalism before we get into English or the monarchs, the absolute monarchs. You have a pretty ingrained hierarchy under feudalism, with kind of the king at the top, the nobles under there, the more minor nobles, maybe some knights under that, and then the peasants at the bottom, who are the vast majority of the population. We're talking like 96% of the population. And then the king owes protection down to the peasants, and then also maybe some sort of like sense of like efficiency of the state. And then the peasants owe food and service up the line. So they might, for instance, have to give a portion of their harvest, which they don't technically own, because oftentimes they're farming on the land of like a noble who owns the vast majority of the land, and they just have very small plots. And then we have, so it's really, pretty awful for serfs. And the feudal system also really restricted getting ahead. So, for instance, if you were a member of the gentry, or this kind of middle class that's starting in between vests to get a little more money, they're making a little money on exploration, maybe they're starting to get into some joint stock companies and capitalism, they're getting a little more wealthy. They also might be controlling access to training via like apprenticeships in guilds. So say you wanted to become like a blacksmith, you couldn't just like open a shop. You had to apprentice to the local blacksmith, who would teach you a trade, and then you would sort of exchange your service for salary. And then eventually the guild would decide, okay, well, you can reach, eventually you could become a master, and then you could start your own shop. But the guild decided how many there were, how many masters in the town, and so they're kind of controlling a lot of that, and increasingly the gentry is in charge of those kinds of things. So you're starting to get this tension between like the monarch at the top, who has a title and a lot of power, and then like the nobility, who has a title and a lot of power over the peasants especially, And now you have this like rising middle class, the gentry, who, as the economy is changing, is getting a lot more economic power, but no political power to go with it. Um, so monarchs before the Enlightenment are ruling based on the divine right of kings, that God had chosen these people to be monarchs, and therefore you couldn't question their authority because that would be questioning God, and that's wrong. Um, you really see this come to a head in the English Civil War, which was 1642 to 46, which we'd have to go back to Henry a little bit. So Henry VIII's daughter, Elizabeth I, eventually rules, like, right? And she rules for a long time. And under her rule, and even before that, Parliament in England had become increasingly powerful. The king still had a lot of power to dissolve Parliament, to call Parliament, but Parliament had some control over taxes, which was important for fighting wars. So in the 17th century, you kind of get this alliance of the nobility and then the more wealthy kind of merchant class um, and professional class that saw themselves as kind of like the voice of the English people, but really they're like pretty wealthy and probably not all that concerned with the regular, coal miner. And eventually, so Elizabeth doesn't have any children, right? She rules for a long time, but never marries because it would have caused all this chaos between, should she marry an English noble? Should she marry a foreign prince? And so Henry VIII had a sister who married the King of Scotland. They had a son who had a daughter who was Mary Queen of Scots. Mary Queen of Scots was married to the French king for a period of time. He died. They didn't have any children yet. She was the Queen of Scotland in her own right, however, because of lack of other heirs, basically, and lack of male heir. So she marries, she has a son who was James the Sixth of Scotland. There he's known as James the Sixth because he was the sixth James, King of Scotland. But after Elizabeth dies, her son, and by the way, Elizabeth had had his mom, Mary Queen of Scots, executed for um, conspiring against her. And so her son, James the Sixth, will become also King James the First of England and Scotland. So he is going to really try to establish an absolute monarchy in England, bringing England and Scotland together. He rules on divine right of kings, that they could have like absolute authority over his subjects. I think divine right of kings is the key thing that you want to know for absolute monarchs. The issue goes back to religion, though, again, because his son, Charles the First, married a sister of the Catholic king, and then Charles keeps. So Charles had a lot of Catholic sympathies, is kind of what it comes down to, and Charles kept calling on Parliament to give him more funds. There was this debate over the ship tax, whether the whole country should pay for the Navy or just the coastal cities, and Charles basically keeps asking for money, and Parliament says no, so he'll dissolve them. And then he wants money again, so he calls them back. They say no, he dissolves them. And then they basically were like, look, if you want any money, you're going to have to give Parliament more power, specifically the power to not be dissolved. And he says no. And so that's going to kind of lead to a stalemate. The English Civil War will be between forces that were loyal to the king and forces that were loyal to Parliament. And so they're trying to kind of challenge the absolute authority of the king. Charles I is eventually defeated by the parliamentary forces and tried and executed for treason. And so now you have no king, right? So this is the Commonwealth period from 1649 to 1660. There's no king for, 11 years? And during that time, Cromwell, who had led the parliamentary military, had created this new model army. He'll rule during this Commonwealth period. He dies. His son's not a great ruler. He rules for a very short period of time, and then they restore the, it would have been the brother of Charles the First to the throne. So it goes James the First, Charles the First, Cromwell, James the Second, Charles the Second. Charles II was pretty Catholic. He married a Catholic. He had two daughters but no sons. When he married this Catholic, I think her name was Henrietta, they had a son. So that meant that he would inherit, right? But he was raised by a Catholic mother. So again, there's all these concerns. Charles wasn't like a great king anyway. So they basically forced him to flee the country, and they asked his daughter, Mary, who was married to William of Orange, to rule jointly with William of Orange. Orange was a region in the Netherlands. And so William and Mary will take the throne in the Glorious Revolution. Other thing to know about that period is Cromwell is a Puritan. He's trying to purify the church, and he they're really trying to kind of end the idea of a state church too, that you could have more religious freedom, because the Puritans were a little different from the Anglicans, because they wanted the Anglican Church to be purified of its Catholic elements. And so he is pretty anti-Catholic, and under Cromwell, there's a lot of persecution of the Irish, of Catholic persecution. So that's the big one for England. For Peter, I want to talk about Louis XIV first. Louis XIV is the one more thing I forgot to say about Mary and William and Mary is when the Restoration falls apart, the restoration of the church of James and Charles, right? So when the Glorious Revolution happens, one of the things that was passed was the English Bill of Rights, which said the king can never again be Catholic, and that there were all these rules about Parliament staying in session and limiting the power of the king in Parliament. But let me talk about France. So, one more thing. There's so much stuff. There's so many details. The John Locke's two treatises on government is published in 1690, which is the year after the Glorious Revolution. So, which is 100 years before the French Revolution of 1789. So you get some mileage out of 89 there. Two treatises on government was the book where he talks about natural rights, life, liberty, and property, and how the government's job is basically to express the will of the people. Okay, so in France, there were two cardinals who were in power, Cardinal Richelieu under Louis XIII and Cardinal Mazarin, who were the kind of running the government for Louis XIII, and then Mazarin under Louis XIV when he takes full control. Because Louis XIV is, I don't know, 3 or 4 when he comes to the throne, because he inherits it really young, so he has a regent in place for a while. And so both Richelieu, Mazarin, and then really kind of perfected under Louis XIV are going to be creating a more centralized government with a lot of like tax collectors and bureaucrats who are trying to make the state more efficient, make the state more powerful, and they're using those funds to fight all of these wars against the Dutch, to try to expand French power. They're also Louis XIV builds the Palace of Versailles because he, as a young child, there was this Fronde uprising where the nobles in Paris, the Parlement, had tried to like overthrow his regency. And so he's pretty nervous about the nobles, and that's like an ongoing kind of conflict, even going back to the new monarchs, is that like what differentiated the new monarchs from previous nobles is the power of the king is able to like really squash some of those more local powers of the nobles. And so Louis XIV uses Versailles as like a pleasure prison. All of the nobles who lived at court had to live there. He was in control of everything. His brother, the Duke of Orleans. There's Louis. I have two. Okay, long story. Anyway, his brother, the Duke of Orleans, basically will create this system that made all life at court revolve around the king. So we talked about like the Vie de Roi. I don't know how to say it. The rising of the king, where like the nobles would sort of gather around the king and have to basically dress him, and it was all based on hierarchy and rank. You had the nobles of the sword and the nobles of the robe. The nobles of the sword were the older nobles who had like long kind of ancient titles, whereas the nobles of the robe were the more recent nobles who had maybe won their titles through some service to the king. He created a lot of, they had a system of intendants, and the intendants, or I think that's how you say it, the intendants basically were government officials whose job it was to do things like collect taxes and to enact the king's laws, but it made them really loyal to the king too because he was paying them and gave them a position and prestige, and so he's really able to like bring the state all under him. You see similar things under Peter the Great, and this is all in contrast to the constitutionalism in England, right? So while England has kind of got the power of the monarchs tamped down by the English Bill of Rights, on the continent, you've got Louis XIV and monarchs like Peter the Great are really increasing the power of the king with no constitution in place. So the Russian czars had, starting with Michael Romanov, will take these kind of local dukedoms, the Muscovy, and create out of those local regions, sort of like you see the city-states in Italy. You had these, they were bigger than city-states though. I guess it'd be closer to Spain, like Aragon. You have these areas, and then the czars are gonna help pull them all together. So Ivan the Terrible was one of the powerful czars there, who maybe wasn't so terrible, maybe was just like really powerful or really. So again, 1689, he reigns. His reign begins the same year as the Glorious Revolution in England, and I never put those two things together until this very moment. The Romanov family is going to give the nobility, in sort of this exchange as they come to power, they'll say to the nobility, you can have complete control over all the peasants underneath you. So that's where the relationship between the nobles and the Tsar in Russia is. Louis is really trying to exert control over everybody via the nobles, whereas Peter is kind of, not Peter, but under Peter, the nobles had a little more power. He's going to be trying to expand Russia's territory, which is going to benefit the nobles, and so that's going to give them a lot more wealth, which is going to make them kind of loyal to the Tsar. He also will put down some revolts, like there was a Cossack rebellion, a Strelsky uprising. The Strelsky were like a kind of minor nobility. There was a military connection there too. So similar to Louis XIV, he has that uprising in his youth. The revolts are squashed. So basically, you've got a bureaucracy kind of created on the model of Western Europe, which Peter had visited. He had done this grand tour of Europe. He's really trying to, France was sort of the center of the world at this point. People were trying to be like the French court. So, for instance, the Peterhof, the palace that Peter built, is this magnificent palace. I wouldn't say similar to Versailles, but like he's trying to do a similar kind of thing. Um, and then they're really going to like emphasize the importance of the Russian Orthodox Church, which taught that like social hierarchy was mandated by God. So again, you see that religious connection, like God decreed this, you can't challenge it. I think the country that is really outside the norm at this time is Poland, Lithuania. Episode 16 of Crash Course European History, if you really want to like get some obscure facts for your to stick in your hat, is on Poland, Lithuania, and it goes into some pretty good detail about how different that system was, and how much they really fall victim to the growing strength of Russia. They had a system called the Liberum Veto, which basically said that if you didn't have unanimous votes on something, nothing passed. All right, it's been about an hour. Do you want? I think we should probably quit now, and I will come back and do this again next Monday. And if we need another session, I can do another session too. I just think that an hour is about the limits of anyone's attention span listening to me droll on and on. Isaac, I don't know if you saw, but I wore my Archduke Franz Ferdinand hoodie, just, to get in the mood, in a European mood. I'm trying to, we didn't talk much about Prussia. While Austria and Russia eventually are sort of on the decline in the 1800s, Prussia is going to be on the rise. You also see the 7 Years' War. By the way, I have the dates of that right here, so I'm going to tell you since we were just talking about it. 1756 to 1793. Great Britain and Prussia had formed an alliance Prussia had formed an alliance with Great Britain, who had previously been their enemies, and then Austria and France were a little freaked out by this, and then it expands into a fight over colonies and continental rivalries. So there's a lot of land and sea battles in the Americas, also in Europe, also in India. The peace agreement is signed in 1763, and it really shifts the balance of power in the Americas to the British, and also the British have a lot of success in India. So that is the big stuff on the 7 Years' War. But I think I will end there. I hope this was helpful. I hope that this works okay because I haven't like I said, YouTube changed their platform. So fingers crossed that this saved for anyone who wasn't able to show up. And I will see you guys on Wednesday. Have a good night. Bye.